Alright, hello everyone. I know it's been a while since I did a video, but I just haven't really had the... I hate that excuse, like I haven't really had the time. It's not really that. I just haven't really gotten around to it. But there has been a lot of music that I wanted to talk about in the past month. So I hopefully will get some more videos talking about some of the things that I've been enjoying the past month. But yeah, the highest priority for me, the album I was the most excited for in the past month or so, was Charli XCX's new record, Crash. For those of you who are not familiar, she's been a pretty prominent pop artist for the last decade. She had a lot of mainstream hits. I Love It, which was kind of her breakout with Icona Pop, and Boom Clap, that's probably her other most popular song. But she kind of transitioned later in her career to a more experimental sound. That transition is really when I started to take a lot of interest in her, because everything that she released after that point was really interesting. Most people probably say the Vroom Vroom EP was like where that transition started. And yeah, I really enjoy all of that music. On the Vroom Vroom EP, but I didn't really get into her until her last album, actually, which was my favorite album of 2020, How I'm Feeling Now, which came out 2020. That was my favorite album that year, and a record that really I really connected with. It kind of had this perfect combination of I think I've mentioned before, but what I what I would say I look for in music to make it some of my favorite music is a combination of like pop appeal, emotional appeal, and something experimental and interesting that makes it stand out. Those are probably what I would say the most important things for me. And this How I'm Feeling Now really captured all three of those. And I would really recommend checking it out. If you are a fan of pop, it's a must hear. I would say it was also an album that meant a lot to me as far as what was going on when it was released. Which was COVID. It was kind of like in the height of COVID it came out. And it definitely really captured that feeling of isolation. And the emotional... Charli's emotions on this album were really beautiful. To hear kind of talking about the issues in her relationship on that album, her issues mentally, and she really painted a very interesting picture when it comes to sex too, and how it's influenced her life, and really just a fantastic record. But not here to talk about that record today, so I'll keep it brief on that. But her new album, Crash, was receiving some backlash before it released. There were a lot of singles for this album, and Charli herself had said that like she was going to make this her sellout album, which is an interesting thing to say. Yeah, calling something a sellout album isn't really a positive trait for the most part, but she was kind of owning into that and looking to really appeal to a wider audience like some of her earlier stuff did. Now, of course, as expected, her core audience, her core fans, were not exactly happy about that. And I honestly can't say I was very happy about that too. I would say her last How I'm Feeling Now was probably her most experimental, and it was my favorite. So to hear her going in the complete opposite direction, I mean, that's concerning. It's understandable that it's concerning. And you know, all these singles released, and fans weren't really that big of a fan of these singles. The first single, Good Ones, came out quite a while ago, and I will say it felt underwhelming initially, but I ended up really liking the track, and I'll get to that later when we go into each track. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure it's got across that this album was under fire before it even released. And it didn't really help when Charli kind of got very frustrated, which is reasonable. It's totally reasonable to get frustrated and like lash out on Twitter, and definitely also didn't bring people in a positive direction for this album. But how was the actual music? Well, I think it's pretty good. That's that's you would think that a video would not be there wouldn't be much to say on an album that's just pretty good. But I do like a lot of this album, despite not liking some of this album. That's kind of the position I'll take. So we're gonna start by talking about individual tracks. Now the opener, which is the title track, Crash, definitely calls back to New Jack Swing sound, which she does a couple times on this album. There's influence of that genre on here for sure. And I like the title track. Crash is pretty good. It's a bit short, but it's catchy, and it feels very polished and clean. It is a throwback in a couple of senses. Like the clean production really reminds me of her early 2010s work and that kind of pop landscape in general. But it's also throwing in all these 80s and early 90s sounds. But that was also a really popular thing in the early 2010s. Like 80s revival was at its peak at that point. But I really like the title track. It's a good signal for what the album is going to be like. And then we come to the second track, which is New Shapes, which was the second single, I believe. And I really like this track. This was one of my favorites before it was released too. This was probably one of the more positively received singles from this album. Fans weren't mad at this. It was a collaboration that everyone would be excited for. Caroline Polachek, Chris from Christine and the Queens, and Charli XCX. Like that's a great trio, and I think all three of them do a really great job. I wasn't really that familiar with Christine's work before this song, but I really liked her singing, especially during her part, the reverb in the background of her making noises. I don't know why. I just really like that. I think it sounds really cool. And yeah, all three of them really bring their own thing to the song, and I think it feels really great. And again, a lot of the 80s influence, you can see it in the cover. It's basically an 80s album art, as well as there was a lot of pictures of her with large hair. The 80s influence is very clear. Then we get to Good Ones, which was the first single, and initially, like I said earlier, Good Ones, I didn't really think much of it, but I think it's a good way to open up to talking about that there's more to this album. Despite Charli calling it just a pop album, her sellout album, I really do think there are thematic tie-ins with How I'm Feeling Now, because that record was so emotional. So much of that record was built on these very powerful emotions about love, about loneliness and depression. So it is weird to follow that up with an album that supposedly strips back all of that emotion. Now, the track Good Ones, it strips back the emotion, but it isn't forgetting it. It isn't just hiding it. This is Charli's reaction to all those emotions. A totally valid reaction. The track Good Ones actually ended up being really, after a lot of listens, I kind of realized it was very sad and depressing in a lot of ways. If you're familiar with how, excuse me, if you're familiar with How I'm Feeling Now and Charli's personal life, she was talking a lot about her boyfriend of 7 years on that album and how they've had a lot of trouble in their relationship. And something that kind of stuck out in that is my favorite song on the album, and one of my favorite songs of all time, the track Forever, where she's talking a lot about how their love is eternal despite whatever happens between them, which I think is a really, really beautiful message. This track, as the first single, it feels like a direct response to that. I mean, her lyrics on here are talking about how she always lets the good ones go. You could assume that based on what she was saying in the last album, that she would consider her ex now one of those good ones. And, keeping all of that in mind, the context in mind, this track goes from being just kind of a traditional, sexy pop song talking about like bad wanting someone because they're bad. Not really anything like that crazy or unique. But the context makes it a really interesting track. And I would say this is how the album is in general. It's on the surface seems pretty normal pop. If you don't know anything about Charli, you will not really think much about these lyrics. But knowing that and kind of keeping in mind that this is her response to all that dramatic those dramatic times in her life, really makes it so this album isn't just a cover up. It's not just like let's get straight to the pop. Let's just stop the personal messaging. This album has a lot of personal messaging, but understandable. This isn't the personal messaging people want. They want more obvious, and they want more noise, which I can admit I love noise. I don't know why, but I am a big fan of it, and I love the way she's always used it. But just because something has worked doesn't mean something else can't also work. You know, the best artists don't stick with their same sound forever. They change it up, and that's okay. So talking more about some of these other tracks, Constant Repeat comes next, which is a pretty good track. I like it, and you can see on this track there still is some of that auto-tune effect that kind of she was known for in a lot of her more experimental work. There definitely is still that influence here on a track like Constant Repeat and Lightning. Lightning feels like it could fit on any of her last 3 or 4 records, really, and it's definitely one of my favorites. Now, after Constant Repeat comes probably the most divisive track, Beg For You, featuring Rina Sawayama, who I'm also a big fan of. Yeah, this track isn't the best. It's really not a song I'm that crazy about. And at first I was like, okay, it's cool. And then I had seen that it's actually like using like the hook from a different song, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But I listened, I'm like, oh, so there's not much to the song. It's basically just like almost close to a cover, really, in my opinion. I'm not trying to discredit the making of the song or say anyone stole anything, but it just sounded way too similar for me to really get into, and kind of it does play a role that is a disappointing collaboration, because neither of them really get to show their best on this track, what people love about them. But I will say I really like how Charli like strains her vocals on the hook. It sounds very like quirky, and it makes the song stand out. So it's not terrible. There's nothing on this album that I would say is terrible. There is some mediocre. It isn't necessarily completely consistent, but there are definitely highlights. This is not just a throwaway record. Moving on to some of the other tracks. I said Lightning, that's one of my favorites. Move Me, I like Move Me too. It's been stuck in my head a bit. Now the final single that was released before, actually I don't think that's true. The single that followed up Beg For You was a song called Baby, which a lot of people like. I'm hesitant. I'm kind of in the middle. Sometimes I like it. Sometimes I think it's kind of obnoxious and I really don't like the beat that much. It feels very forgettable, honestly, to me. But still not bad. Definitely not bad. I guess if there was one track I say that is bad, it is the track Every Rule, which I really am just not a fan of. It feels really fake. And of course that fakeness makes sense based on what I was talking about earlier. Charli is kind of pushing herself out there, like getting involved in experiences and particularly romantic experiences. It's kind of her means of pushing through the heartbreak she went through with her ex-boyfriend and all the emotions that came on her last album. There's nothing wrong with that. I totally understand it, and I think it's interesting. It's an interesting angle. But this track just feels very just fake. And also I just don't really like the melody. It's pretty much like an attempt to do like one of those 80s slow ballad tracks. And it's not like I am particularly a big fan of those kinds of tracks. And I don't think this song does anything to change my mind on that, unfortunately. So honestly, I could cut that track. I really don't think it's very good. As for the rest of the album, let's see. The track "Yuck," I really like the track "Yuck," even though it feels very clearly like TikTok bait. There's nothing. That's okay. I don't know if the song actually is getting big on TikTok, but it definitely deserves to be. Like that hook is really catchy. Definitely fits with the short. I don't know. Is that true? This 7 seconds, or is that just was Vine? But it fits with those short videos really well, I would say. So if you're big into TikTok, I would recommend using this track. I don't know, but the only other track I would say I don't like is the track "Used to Know Me," but partially that might be because I'm just not a big house music fan. This track feels very generic house music, and you know what, I'm not gonna say that it shouldn't have been kept on the record because I think it is getting traction. I'm assuming in those settings, and that's great. That's great for Charli if she wanted to like tap into that audience. But I just find this track really generic. Basically, the beat feels like every EDM, like generic EDM song that you would hear at a club. Not to say that all EDM is generic, but this sounds like generic EDM. And the last track, "Twice," I think is also really emotional. Kind of like where the cracks like break through a little bit as far as her like the exterior she's putting on of like happy and moving and processing everything and living her best life. You see on "Twice" kind of like that breakdown a bit where she's kind of re-embracing a lot of the sadness she was feeling on the last record. And I think that's really interesting. And "Twice" is another really great track. So, overall, I do enjoy this record. And I definitely will be going back to it to listen to a lot of these tracks. But is it as quality as and is it as quality and as ambitious as her last 3 projects? No, but that's okay. Charli can go in whatever direction she feels is right, and I will be excited to see even just one great song on an album is pretty great. So I would say that I wish Charli the best with still processing all of this stuff and also kind of just being able to stick to what she wants to do in her music rather than getting distracted by the fans and the people who aren't even fans. A lot of people can say a lot, but really I think she should stick with what she thinks is going to be best. Yeah, and that's about it. Those are my thoughts on Charli XCX's new record, Crash. I definitely recommend giving it a shot if you're a fan of pop music. Yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I will hopefully get out some more videos soon. I have ideas, but not exactly sure which of them I'm going to go for. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next video.